Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The air in the Alpha's grand hall was thick enough to swallow. It tasted of roasted boar, pine from the great rafters, and 100 competing perfumes that failed to mask the scent of ambition. Jenny stood near a stone pillar, trying to make her gray dress melt into the shadows. Her goal was simple: invisibility. She wanted to be a ghost at the feast, a forgotten wisp of air, because to be seen was to be judged. The memory of her failed mating ceremony, a public spectacle of hope turning to ash, clung to her like a shroud. She watched the other she-wolves, their laughter bright and sharp, their hips swaying with the promise of future pups. They were whole. She was a void. Consequently, she kept her eyes fixed on the swirling patterns in her lukewarm cider, tracing the shapes with her gaze. The murmur of the pack was a dull roar, a beast she'd learned to live inside without provoking. But the beast had teeth, and its name was Kael. He appeared before her, his new mate, Lyra, clinging to his arm like a decorative vine. Kael's smile was the same charming slash it had always been, but now it was a weapon aimed directly at her heart. Lyra's eyes, a cold, flat blue, raked over Jenny's form with dismissive appraisal. "Jenny," Kael began, his voice a smooth, polished stone. "I was surprised to see you came. I thought you'd be resting." The word hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. She lifted her chin, the movement feeling brittle. "Why would I be resting, Kael?" His smirk widened, a cruel, knowing thing. "Oh, I don't know. All that emptiness must be tiring." He gestured vaguely toward her stomach. "An empty house gets drafty, doesn't it? An empty womb must get lonely." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, and the hall's noise faded to a distant hum. Lyra giggled, a sound like splintering glass. Jenny's world narrowed to Kael's triumphant face, the face she once thought she would love forever. She wanted to scream, to claw that smirk away, to show him the jagged ruin he'd made of her. But she was frozen. She was a statue of shame, a monument to being not enough. She had to be strong, had to be silent, had to endure. Suddenly, a change rippled through the hall. It wasn't a sound, but a cessation of it. The boisterous laughter died. The clinking of goblets ceased. The air itself grew heavy, charged with an ancient, terrifying power that made the hairs on Jenny's arms stand on end. Every wolf in the room, from the lowest omega to Kael himself, stiffened and lowered their gaze. A colossal shadow fell from the high entrance, stretching across the feasting tables and swallowing the firelight. It was a silhouette of impossible size and presence, a darkness that felt more solid than the stone walls around them. No one dared to breathe. The Alpha King had arrived, and that shadow, vast and absolute, was creeping directly toward her. Chapter 2. The Silent Gaze. Following that oppressive silence, the crowd parted like a tide receding from a jagged shore. There, framed by the massive oak doors, stood Alpha King Ethan. He was not just a wolf. He was a myth, made flesh. Taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of all the packs, he commanded the space without a word. His hair was the color of a moonless night, and his face was carved from hard lines and stark angles, beautiful but unforgiving. He wore simple black leathers, yet they seemed more regal than any ceremonial robes because of the sheer force of the man within them. Whispers followed his slow, deliberate steps. He never attended these minor pack gatherings. Why now? Jenny's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden quiet. Everyone knew the stories. They said his eyes glowed with the light of a dying star. They said he could stop a heart with a single command. They said he was cursed, that no mate could ever be destined for him. Kael and Lyra had shrunk away, their earlier cruelty forgotten in the face of true authority. But the king's attention wasn't on them. His gaze, a piercing, startling silver, swept over the room once before landing, impossibly on her. It wasn't a glance. It was a physical weight, a tangible focus that pinned her to the spot. He wasn't looking at her the way other males did, with pity or disdain. This was different. It felt like he was peeling back the layers of her skin, peering past the shame and the brokenness, and seeing something deep inside her she didn't even know was there. A strange scent drifted toward her, ozone after a lightning strike and the deep, clean smell of an ancient forest. What was that? It was a distraction, a confusing note in a symphony of terror. Why would a king, a living legend, single out the pack's most notorious failure? Therefore, her mind raced, searching for an explanation. Had she broken some unknown law? Was she to be made an example of? She felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, certain that every wolf in the hall was now staring at her, their curiosity 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. She forced herself to meet his stare for a fraction of a second. The intensity she found there stole her breath. It was a raw, predatory focus, an unnerving stillness that promised violence and something else, something she couldn't name. It was too much. This scrutiny, this silent claiming of her attention, was 1,000 times worse than Kael's public mockery. She had to escape. She broke the gaze, her head snapping down as she took a shaky step back. His focus felt like a brand on her skin, hot and indelible. Another step. Another. She turned, her movements clumsy, and fled from the hall. She didn't look back, but she could feel his silver eyes following her, a silent hunter watching its prey. She didn't just want to leave the party. She needed to run from the man who saw too much. Chapter 3. A Touch of Fate. As a result of that suffocating attention, Jenny burst from the great hall into the cool night. The forest beckoned, a familiar sanctuary of tangled roots and whispering leaves. She ran, heedless of the branches that snagged her dress or the stones that bruised her feet. The sounds of the gathering faded behind her, replaced by the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. She didn't stop until her lungs burned and her legs ached, collapsing against the rough bark of an ancient oak. The woods were supposed to be her refuge, but tonight, the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe with unseen life. A low growl rumbled from the darkness to her left. It was not the sound of a pack wolf. This was rougher, edged with a desperate hunger. Jenny froze. 3 pairs of yellow eyes materialized between the trees, attached to lean, mangy bodies. Rogues, outcasts driven mad by solitude and starvation. Fear, cold and sharp, sliced through her. She was a healer, not a fighter, and she was alone. The lead rogue, a hulking brute with a scarred muzzle, took a stalking step forward, a string of drool dripping from its jowls. Its intent was brutally clear. Just as the rogue prepared to lunge, a blur of motion exploded from the deeper shadows behind her. It was silent, fluid, and utterly lethal. Alpha King Ethan moved with a grace that defied his size, a phantom of controlled fury. Before the first rogue could even snarl, the king's hand lashed out, a crack of bone echoing through the quiet woods. The second one met a similar fate, tossed aside like a broken doll. The scarred leader, momentarily stunned by the sheer speed of the assault, launched itself at Ethan with a savage roar. It was a mistake. Ethan didn't sidestep. He met the attack head-on, his body a bulwark of raw power. There was a brief, brutal struggle, and then... silence. The rogue fell to the forest floor, unmoving. Ethan stood over the fallen wolves, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, utterly untouched. He turned to face her, his silver eyes catching the moonlight, glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. The primal warrior was gone, replaced by that same unnerving stillness from the hall. He took a slow step toward her, his expression unreadable. Jenny was trapped between terror and a bewildering sense of awe. He had saved her. Why? He stopped just before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Without a word, he reached out, his large, calloused hand gently touching her arm where a branch had scratched it. The moment his skin met hers, the world exploded. It was not a spark. It was a supernova. A bolt of pure energy shot up her arm, straight to her core, igniting every nerve ending in her body. The air crackled. She gasped, her mind flooded with a tidal wave of sensations that were not her own. A fierce protectiveness, a profound loneliness that mirrored her own, and a possessive fire that sought to consume her. It was the mate bond, the sacred, undeniable connection she had been told she could never have. And it was snapping into place with the one man in the world who was supposedly immune to it. Her universe shattered, disbelief warring with a truth so potent it was rewriting her very soul. Chapter 4: The Impossible Proclamation. The world slammed back into focus with a dizzying rush. Jenny's mind, still reeling from the supernova of the bond, struggled to process the man standing before her. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was a part of her. She could feel the steady, ancient calm that anchored his soul, a stark contrast to the hurricane of her own panic. His emotions were a low hum beneath her own, a deep ocean current of possessiveness, concern, and something else, a profound aching loneliness that mirrored her own so perfectly it made her gasp. He hadn't released her arm. His touch was no longer just skin on skin. It was an anchor in a reality that had tilted off its axis. He said nothing, simply turned and began walking back toward the great hall, his grip firm, giving her no choice but to follow. Consequently, every step was a battle. She stumbled behind him, her thoughts a tangled mess. This couldn't be happening. The moon goddess was cruel, but was she cruel enough to play this kind of joke? To bind the broken Omega to the cursed king? It was a death sentence, a public execution of what little dignity she had left. As they reached the massive oak doors, the noise from within washed over them, but it sounded distant, warped, as if she were hearing it from underwater. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the doors open and strode back into the center of the room, pulling her along into the glaring firelight where every single eye could see them. The silence that fell was even more profound than before. It was a vacuum, heavy with shock and 1,000 unspoken questions. Kael's face was a mask of disbelief, his jaw hanging open. Lyra looked as though she'd been slapped. Jenny wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole, because this exposure was 100 times more agonizing than the shame she had felt earlier. Then Ethan stopped. He stood in the very heart of the hall, a pillar of unshakable authority, and finally released her arm, only to place a heavy, proprietary hand on the small of her back. He drew in a breath, and the sound seemed to fill the entire chamber. When he spoke, his voice was not a shout, but a low, resonant command that vibrated through the stone floor and up into Jenny's bones. "You will all bear witness." His silver eyes scanned the crowd, daring a single wolf to look away. "Fate has spoken this night. The great hunt is over." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before delivering the final world-shattering blow. "This she-wolf Jenny of the Silver Creek Pack is my fated mate." He let that sink in for a moment, then added 2 more words that sealed her doom. "My queen." A collective gasp sucked the remaining air from the room. It was not a sound of joy or celebration. It was the sharp, indrawn breath of shock, of outrage, of impending chaos. Jenny's vision swam. Queen? Her? The barren wolf? The pack's cautionary tale? It was impossible. It was a declaration of war. She wasn't being chosen. She was being used as a pawn in a game she couldn't comprehend. The faces in the crowd blurred into a tapestry of horror and envy, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that her life was over. The king hadn't just saved her in the woods. He had just condemned her to something far worse. Chapter 5: The Dangerous Certainty. He swept her from the great hall before the stunned silence could break into a roar of questions and accusations. They were in a small, cold antechamber, the heavy door thudding shut behind them, muffling the rising din of the pack. The sudden quiet was suffocating. Jenny wrenched herself away from him, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the unyielding stone of the far wall. She was cornered, trapped. Her breath came in short, frantic pants. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "You can't." Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable, his stillness a terrifying counterpoint to her hysteria. "It is already done." "Take it back," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Go out there and tell them it was a mistake, a joke, anything." She pushed her hands through her hair, her knuckles white. She had to make him understand the catastrophe he had just set in motion, because he was clearly insane. "They will tear you apart. They'll say you're weak, that you've been bewitched by a defective Omega. You don't want me." She threw the words at him like stones, hoping to build a wall between them. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I do not care what they say." "You have to," she insisted, her voice rising. "I am not queen material. I'm broken." She finally said it, the ugliest truth she owned, the secret shame that had defined her entire existence. She forced herself to meet his gaze, letting him see all the cracks in her soul. "I can't give you an heir, Your Majesty. I am barren." The confession was a poisoned dart, the ultimate reason he should cast her aside. It was her only defense. For the first time, an emotion flickered in those silver eyes. Not pity, but a flash of something dark and dangerous. He closed the remaining distance between them in 2 long strides, placing his hands on the wall on either side of her head, caging her in completely. He was so close she could feel the furnace-like heat of his body, smell that intoxicating scent of storm and forest. "Do you truly believe," he murmured, his voice a low, perilous rumble, "that my line is so fragile it depends on a pup?" He leaned closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Fate does not make mistakes. The moon goddess chose you. I choose you." A shudder racked her body. His certainty was terrifying. It was an absolute, unshakable force that battered against the walls of her own self-loathing. Part of her, a tiny, treasonous part, yearned to believe him, to collapse into this impossible strength. But fear was a more powerful master. This was a fantasy that would get them both killed. "Please," she choked out. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes again. "You will fight me on this," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "It will not matter." A possessive, almost feral light entered his gaze. "I will not let you go." Chapter 6. Bound by Blood. Numbness was a mercy. Jenny walked beside him through a labyrinth of cold, torch-lit corridors, her feet moving without conscious thought. The echo of his final words, "I will not let you go," reverberated in the hollow spaces of her mind. She felt like a ghost, detached from her own body, simply following this overwhelming force of nature who had hijacked her life. He was leading her to a set of secluded chambers, a gilded cage he intended to keep her in. The air was thick with the scent of old stone, beeswax, and the unspoken tension that crackled between them. He hadn't touched her again, but she could feel his presence like a physical touch, a constant, heavy awareness at her side. They rounded a corner into a more secluded hallway, the shadows deeper here, the tapestries on the walls swallowing the light. It happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. A whisper of movement from a darkened alcove, the glint of steel in the flickering torchlight. A figure lunged from the darkness, not at the king, but directly at her. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Jenny saw a masked face, eyes filled with a fanatic's hatred, and the downward arc of a long, thin dagger coated in some viscous, dark substance. Poison. There was no time to scream, no space to run, but Ethan moved like lightning. He didn't shove her aside. Instead, he spun, inserting his own body between her and the attacker with impossible speed. There was a sickening, wet thud, as the blade, meant for her heart, plunged deep into his forearm. Ethan let out a low, guttural growl, a sound more animal than man, as his other hand shot out, grabbing the assassin by the throat. The fight was brutally short. There was a desperate gurgle, a sharp crack of bone, and the masked figure crumpled to the floor in a boneless heap. Silence descended once more, broken only by the sound of something wet dripping onto the stone floor. Blood. The king's blood. It was a dark, shocking crimson against the pale stone, dripping from the gash in his arm. He stood breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from a rage so profound it seemed to make the very air vibrate. He kicked the dagger away from the lifeless form on the floor before turning his blazing silver eyes on her. The message in them was clearer than any words he could have spoken. This is your world now. This is the danger you face. This is why you cannot be alone. The abstract threat of his enemies had just become terrifyingly real. A dead body at their feet and the king's lifeblood spilled to protect her. In that moment, Jenny's denial shattered completely, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. Her old life was gone. Her struggle was no longer about preserving her heart or her solitude. Her new singular purpose had just been baptized in blood she had to survive. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Den. The next few days were a blur of gilded cages and suffocating luxury. Jenny was moved into a suite of rooms so vast and opulent she felt like a field mouse wandering through a cathedral. Silks replaced her rough-spun wool, and servants appeared with silent, unnerving efficiency. Yet beneath the polished surface of this new life, a cold, sharp-edged fear remained her constant companion. The true test came when Ethan decreed she would join him in the throne room. To be seen, to be acknowledged. Escorted by 2 of his personal guard, she walked down a hall of polished marble so reflective she could see a distorted, terrified version of herself with every step. Therefore, when she entered the vast, cavernous space, it felt like stepping into a den of beautifully dressed serpents. The court was assembled, dozens of high-born wolves whose lineage stretched back for generations. They were a landscape of silks and jewels, their faces arranged in masks of polite curiosity. But their eyes were cold and calculating. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves, a sound that stopped the moment she turned her head and resumed the second she looked away. She could feel their judgment, a physical weight pressing down on her. They were vultures, circling, waiting to see if she was strong enough to survive, or if she was merely the king's latest, most bizarre amusement. An elegant she-wolf with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like chips of ice stepped forward. Her name was Lady Seraphina, the mate of his chief strategist, and her smile was a beautiful, predatory thing. "Welcome, my lady," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She looked Jenny up and down, a slow, deliberate appraisal that catalogued her simple gown and her non-noble bearing. "We were all so surprised. The king has been alone for so long. To choose someone of such humble origins. It speaks to your hidden strengths, I'm sure." The insult was perfectly wrapped in the guise of a compliment, a poisoned needle disguised as a flower. Jenny's throat went dry. Her mind went blank. What could she say? Thank you? A fire of shame burned on her cheeks. Before she could stammer out a reply, a warm, heavy hand settled on the small of her back. Ethan had moved to her side so silently she hadn't even noticed. He didn't look at Seraphina. His gaze remained fixed on the far end of the room, as if she were nothing more than a buzzing insect. "My mate's strengths," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that nonetheless carried to every corner of the silent room, "are not for you to appraise, Seraphina. They are for me to appreciate." The veiled threat was unmistakable. The color drained from Seraphina's face, and she offered a hasty curtsy before melting back into the crowd. The whispers died completely. Ethan's hand remained on her back, a steady, possessive heat that seeped through the fabric of her dress. It was a gesture of ownership, a public branding. But beneath the terror of it all, a strange and forbidden warmth bloomed in her chest. He was her captor, the architect of this nightmare, but in this den of serpents, he was also her only shield. Chapter 8. A Lesson in Power. Later that evening, he found her on a stone balcony overlooking the moon-drenched royal gardens. The air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. Jenny stared out at the silvered leaves, hugging herself, trying to reclaim some small piece of the solitude she had lost forever. She felt his presence before she heard him, a shift in the energy of the night, a deepening of the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of the royal command it held in the throne room. "You cannot show them your fear." Jenny flinched, but didn't turn around. "I don't know how to be anything else," she confessed, the words a raw, honest whisper. "I don't belong here. I am not like them." "No," he agreed, stepping to stand beside her, his proximity a potent force that made her skin tingle. "You are not. That is why you were chosen." He was silent for a moment, studying her profile. "But they are predators. They survive on sensing weakness. You must learn to starve them." He moved in front of her then, blocking her view of the gardens. Gently, with a surprising delicacy for a man so large, he placed a finger under her chin and tilted her head up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Your chin up," he instructed, his voice a low murmur. "Shoulders back." He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch both firm and careful, guiding them into a posture of confidence she did not feel. The contact was electric. It was not the touch of a king to a subject, but of a trainer, a partner, something far more intimate and confusing. She could see the flecks of charcoal in his silver irises, could feel his breath ghosting across her cheek. The world narrowed to the space between them, a bubble of charged intimacy in the vast, lonely night. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. He was teaching her how to pretend, how to build an armor of arrogance she had never wanted. He held her gaze, and for a fleeting instant, the immense power and crushing loneliness in his eyes softened. He was not just the Alpha King, he was a man, and he was looking at her, Jenny, as if he saw a strength in her she couldn't see in herself. Because of this profound connection, the air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He leaned in, his head dipping slowly, his gaze dropping to her lips. This is it, she thought, a thrill of terror and longing shooting through her. An almost kiss. The first touch of their lips would be a final, irrevocable seal on her fate. She could feel the magnetic pull, the undeniable chemistry that the bond had forged between them. Her eyes fluttered closed in anticipation. But then, just as she felt the barest whisper of his breath against her skin, he pulled back. He let go of her shoulders, and the spell was broken. She was left breathless and trembling, the ghost of his touch and the phantom of a kiss burning in the air between them, a question that now had no answer. Chapter 9: The Alpha's Shield. The summons had been abrupt. Two rival alphas, Marcus of the Black Mountain Pack and Fendril of the Riverlands, had arrived to pay their respects to the king's new mate. It was not a social call, it was an inspection. A test. Jenny sat on a smaller, unadorned throne beside Ethan's massive one, feeling like a child's doll put on display. The tension in the private council chamber was a palpable thing, a low hum of testosterone and ambition. Alpha Marcus, a wolf known for his cunning intellect and his barely concealed desire for Ethan's throne, had a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. After the initial pleasantries, Marcus turned his attention directly to her. "My queen," he said, his voice deceptively smooth. "Your unique perspective is a great asset, I am sure. I am curious how you feel the king's new trade tariffs on river pelts will affect the smaller hunting clans in the Eastern Territories. Some fear it will lead to instability." The question was a perfectly crafted trap. It was complex, political, and had no right answer. If she agreed with the tariff, she was a puppet. If she disagreed, she undermined Ethan. If she admitted ignorance, she was a fool. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. The faces of the alphas swam before her. This was what Seraphina's snide remarks had been building to. This was the real test. She opened her mouth, a jumble of panicked thoughts crashing in her mind, but no sound came out. She froze. The weight of their expectant stares, the glint of victory in Marcus's eyes. It was too much. The old Jenny, the one who knew only how to shrink and hide, took over completely. She was failing. She was shaming him. Just as the silence stretched into a fatal, damning indictment of her inadequacy, Ethan leaned forward slightly. He did not look at her. He fixed Alpha Marcus with a look of cold amusement. "My mate, Alpha Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "has a mind for larger matters than pelts. She finds your focus on such trivialities telling." He let the words hang in the air. "She was just conveying to me her concern that the Black Mountain Pack's loyalty might be as easily bought and sold as a few furs. Your question has done little to assuage her fears." The chamber became deathly quiet. Ethan had not just shielded her. He had taken Marcus's spear and hurled it back with deadly force, turning her frozen silence from a sign of weakness into a silent, damning judgment. Marcus's face tightened, the fake smile vanishing, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He had been outplayed. The immediate danger passed, but as Jenny risked a glance at the rival Alpha, she saw the chilling satisfaction glinting in his eyes. He had lost the exchange, but he had won something far more valuable. He had found Ethan's weakness. It was her. For the first time, Jenny understood the terrifying truth of her situation. Her failure would not just be her own. Her weakness, her fear, her inability to play this deadly game, it could be the weapon his enemies used to destroy him. Chapter 10. A Whisper of Treason. The weight of her failure in the council chamber was a physical burden. For 2 days, Jenny avoided the main halls, seeking solace in the castle's sprawling, sun-dappled library. Surrounded by the scent of old paper and leather, she felt a measure of peace. She was a liability in matters of state, a doll on a throne. But here, with stories of old magic and forgotten histories, she felt a flicker of her old self. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, while tucked away in an alcove of astronomical charts, that she heard the voices. They were low, conspiratorial murmurs from the other side of a towering bookshelf. "The shipment arrives at the southern gate at dusk." One voice, rough and unfamiliar, hissed. "The patrol is thin there, a blind spot." "And the king?" a second voice asked, this one smoother, possessing a note of cultured arrogance she vaguely recognized from court. "He inspects the wall fortifications himself, alone, as is his custom." A dry chuckle. "His predictability will be his undoing. A single, well-placed blade is all it will take. It will look like a rogue attack. No one will suspect." Ice flooded Jenny's veins. The words were not just whispers. They were shards of glass aimed at the heart of the kingdom. Her first instinct was to shrink back, to pretend she hadn't heard. Who would believe her? The broken Omega, hysterical and seeing shadows everywhere. They would dismiss her, accuse her of seeking attention. She would become a joke, and in doing so, make Ethan look even weaker for choosing her. Fear was a cold, heavy blanket, urging her to stay silent, to protect herself. But then, an image flashed in her mind. Ethan's blood, dark and stark against the pale stone floor, spilled for her. He had shielded her. Now, the choice was hers. Could she do the same for him? Because she could not bear the thought of his death on her conscience, she made her decision. She scrambled from the alcove and ran. She found Ethan in the armory, his advisors, a grim circle of seasoned warriors surrounding him. He was examining a new sword, the firelight gleaming off the polished steel. Every head turned as she burst in, breathless and disheveled. One of the advisors, a grizzled wolf named Lord Valerius, scowled at her interruption. "My queen, the king is occupied with matters of grave importance." "This is a matter of grave importance," she gasped out, her eyes fixed on Ethan. She relayed what she had heard, the words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. She saw the skepticism dawn on Valerius's face, the dismissive glance he shot at the other advisors. They did not believe her. Her heart sank. It was exactly as she'd feared. She had made a terrible mistake. But Ethan had not looked at his advisors. His silver eyes were locked on her, searching her face, not for proof, but for sincerity. He saw the genuine terror there, the fear for him. He placed the sword down with a soft, definitive click. The sound silenced the room. He ignored the doubtful expressions of his most trusted men and took a step toward her. His voice was quiet, yet it held the absolute power of a king. "Show me where you heard this." It was not a request. It was a statement of faith. In that moment, surrounded by warriors who saw her as a fool, the Alpha King chose to trust her word. That single act of belief was more empowering than any crown, a silent promise that perhaps she was not just a liability after all. Chapter 11. The Curse. The plot had been real. A handful of traitors were now rotting in the dungeons, the castle was on high alert, and an unnerving quiet had settled over the royal wing. Ethan had summoned her to his private chambers late that night. The room was Spartan for a king, dominated by a massive fireplace where flames danced and wrestled with the shadows. He stood staring into the fire, his back to her, the tension in his broad shoulders a tangible thing. He had dismissed his guards. They were utterly alone. "You saved my life tonight," he said without turning, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be pulled from the depths of the earth. "I only did what anyone would have," she whispered, twisting her fingers together. She still felt like an imposter, her one useful act an accident of being in the right place at the right time. "No," he said, finally turning to face her. The firelight carved his face into harsh planes of light and shadow, making his silver eyes seem to burn with their own internal light. No one else could have. He took a step closer, and the air between them grew thick, charged with the aftermath of shared danger. "Jenny, there is something you must understand about the bond between us, why it is not merely unlikely, but impossible." He gestured to a chair, but remained standing himself, pacing before the hearth like a caged lion. He told her a story then of an ancestor, the first Alpha King, who had made a pact with a vengeful witch. Power for a price. The price was his bloodline. The witch had cursed them, a cruel, specific magic that would sever their connection to the moon goddess's greatest gift. "The curse decrees," Ethan explained, his voice rough with an ancient pain, "that no Alpha King of my line will ever know his fated mate. For generations, the bond has been a dead thing inside us, a silent, empty chamber in our souls where a fire is supposed to burn." He stopped pacing and looked directly at her, his gaze raw with a vulnerability she never imagined he possessed. "I have felt nothing my entire life," he confessed. "A void, a quiet so profound I thought it was normal. I was born to be alone. The bond between us, it should not exist." He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was towering over her. "And then I saw you at that gathering, and for the first time in my life, I felt a stir, a pull. When I touched you in the woods," he trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. "The fire everyone speaks of. It was an inferno. You are not a mistake, Jenny. You are a miracle. You are the one who is breaking my curse." The revelation struck her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just a king burdened by power. He was a man who had been starved of the most fundamental connection a wolf can know. He was broken, too. Her barrenness and his dormant bond. They were two halves of an impossible whole. The last of her fear, the last of her resistance, crumbled into dust. This man didn't see her as defective. He saw her as his salvation. All the unspoken emotions between them, the terror, the desire, the fragile trust, crested into a tidal wave. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw with a reverence that made her tremble. He lowered his head, and this time, there was no hesitation. His lips met hers, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry claiming, a collision of two lonely souls who had just discovered they were not, in fact, alone at all. Chapter 12. The Ghost of the Past. The kiss had changed everything. The world felt sharper, brighter, the bond between them a living, breathing entity that hummed with a fierce, protective energy. A fragile confidence had taken root in Jenny's heart, nurtured by his trust and the staggering revelation of his curse. For the first time since arriving at the castle, she walked through the halls not as an imposter, but as a woman who had a place, however dangerous, at the king's side. The court noticed the shift. The whispers were still there, but now they were tinged with a grudging respect. The mate who had saved the king's life was not someone to be so easily dismissed. It was this newfound sense of balance that was shattered when the court herald announced an unscheduled petitioner. "Kael of the Silver Creek Pack, your majesties," the herald intoned, and Jenny's blood ran cold. She looked at Ethan, who sat impassive on his throne, but she could feel a spike of cold fury through their bond. He gave a curt nod, and a moment later, Kael was striding into the throne room, his head bowed in a show of feigned humility. He stopped before them, dropping to one knee. "My king, my queen," he began, his voice thick with a carefully crafted remorse. He did not look at Ethan. His eyes were fixed on Jenny, and they were filled with a pleading she knew was utterly false. "I have journeyed here to beg your forgiveness. My forgiveness, most of all," he said, his voice breaking. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I allowed the pressure of the pack, the obsession with an heir, to cloud my heart. I cast aside the most precious gift the goddess ever gave me." He looked up at her, his expression a perfect mask of a broken man. "He is a king, Jenny. He can offer you a crown. But he cannot know you as I did. He cannot love the girl who used to sneak away to watch the sunrise with me." The words were a calculated assault, meant to remind her of a shared past, to paint Ethan as a cold, political usurper, and himself as the lost true love. A year ago, his speech would have shattered her. Now she felt nothing, a hollow sort of pity. She saw him for what he was, a petty, ambitious male who had realized too late that the stone he had discarded was now the king's diamond. She compared his slick, rehearsed performance to the raw, painful honesty Ethan had shown her in the firelight. There was no contest. When he finished, a hopeful silence filled the room. All eyes were on her. This was another test, a more personal one. Jenny took a breath, feeling the steady strength of Ethan's presence beside her. She did not look at him. She looked down at the man kneeling on the floor, the ghost of a life she no longer wanted. "There is nothing to forgive, Kael," she said, her voice clear and cold, utterly devoid of the trembling uncertainty that had once defined her. "Because the girl you knew is gone. You saw to that. Your apology is not for me, it is for yourself. You may rise." Then she added with a finality that echoed through the throne room, "And you may leave." A wave of shock rippled through the court. Kael's face went from pleading to stunned, and then to a dark, venomous fury. He had been publicly rejected. As the guards escorted him out, his eyes met hers one last time. It was not the look of a spurned lover. It was the look of a man who had just become another enemy. The past was not buried. It had just been given teeth. Chapter 13. An accusation and a defiance. Kael did not leave. Instead, he festered. He haunted the lower city, a ghost at the feast, whispering poison into the ears of anyone who would listen. He spoke of tradition, of sacred first matings, of a powerful king who took what he wanted, heedless of the law. He was gathering support, weaving a narrative of tyranny with himself as the victim. The confrontation, when it came, was not in the throne room, but in the open-air training yard. Ethan was observing his warriors with Jenny standing at his side, the crisp morning air smelling of steel and sweat. Kael appeared at the edge of the yard, a small crowd of grim-faced traditionalist wolves behind him. He was done pleading. He strode onto the packed earth, his voice ringing with righteous fury. "Alpha King Ethan!" he shouted, a blatant challenge. "You stand here with what is mine by sacred law. You used your power, your title, to bewitch her, to turn her head and steal her from a sealed mating." He pointed a trembling finger at Jenny. "She belongs to Silver Creek. She belongs to me. You are no king. You are a thief who hides behind a crown. The accusation was a declaration of war, an attempt to paint Ethan as a despot who trampled the very traditions he was sworn to uphold. The training warriors stopped, their hands resting on their sword hilts, the yard falling into a tense, dangerous silence. A younger Jenny would have wilted under the venom of his words, crushed by the public shaming. But something new and fierce had taken root in her soul. It was a cold, protective rage, not for herself, but for the man beside her. She saw Kael's ploy with perfect clarity. This wasn't about love or loss. It was about his pathetic, bruised ego. He couldn't stand that the woman he'd discarded as worthless was now seen as a treasure. Before Ethan could issue a command that would prove Kael's point, before he could act the tyrant, Jenny stepped forward. She moved into the space between them, a lone, slender figure against two powerful alphas. She did not look at Kael. She looked at the assembled warriors, at the uncertain faces in the crowd. The law Kael speaks of is meant to protect a sacred bond, she said, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant, carrying across the yard. It is not a chain to shackle a she-wolf to a male who sees her only as a vessel for an heir. She finally turned her gaze on Kael, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. There was no heart in our mating, only duty. You broke it not when the king claimed me, but when you humiliated me, when you called me empty. Then, she did the unthinkable. She turned her back on him completely, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and faced Ethan. In front of the entire court, she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. The connection of the bond flared between them, a visible shimmer in the air for those sensitive enough to see. My bond is here. My loyalty is here. Her voice rose, ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. My place is with my king, my mate. It was not just a defense, it was a claiming. An omega, publicly choosing her mate and defying the traditions of 1,000 years. The silence that followed was absolute, the world holding its breath at her audacity. Chapter 14. A Bond Forged in Fire. The aftermath of her defiance lingered in the air long into the night. Back in Ethan's chambers, the silence was no longer tense, but thick with a raw, humming energy. He stood by the window, staring out at the slumbering city, the moonlight tracing the powerful lines of his shoulders. He had said very little since her public declaration, but she could feel his emotions churning through the bond. A fierce, smoldering pride that was so potent it made her feel weak in the knees. He finally turned to face her, his silver eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to peel away every one of her defenses. Today, he said, his voice a low, rough velvet, in that yard, you were not just my mate. You were a queen. I was terrified, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. But I couldn't let him diminish you. He did not diminish me, Ethan murmured, crossing the room until he stood directly before her. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. He revealed you. The simple words were a balm on every wound she had ever suffered. He didn't see her as a liability or a burden. He saw her as a hidden strength. That look, that single touch, was the final key that unlocked the last of her reservations. The slow burn that had been building between them for weeks finally crested, threatening to flash into a wildfire. This was the point of no return. Because she finally believed she was worthy of him, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, hesitant question that he answered with a groan, his arms sweeping around her, pulling her flush against the hard wall of his chest. The kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry conversation. It spoke of lonely nights and a shared, broken past. It spoke of a future that was terrifying and uncertain, but one they would face together. He swept her into his arms and carried her to the bed, his movements fluid and sure, yet filled with a reverence that made her heart ache. This was not a claiming of power, but an act of worship. As he shed her clothes and then his own, his eyes never left hers, and the emotions that poured through the bond were overwhelming. Awe, gratitude, a desperate need that went far beyond the physical. His hands, the same hands that had ended the lives of traitors and held the fate of the packs, traced the lines of her body as if he were memorizing a sacred text. He paid homage to the scars she tried to hide, to the perceived imperfections she had always hated. He kissed the stomach she had always thought of as empty and useless, and whispered against her skin, "You are everything." For the first time, Jenny felt not just desired, but whole. She surrendered to him, to the bond, to the breathtaking reality of being loved not in spite of her broken pieces, but because of them. In the heart of the fire, their bond was not just fated, it was forged. Chapter 15. The Serpent in the Garden. Jenny awoke to the soft gray light of dawn, tangled in linen sheets and wrapped in the solid, comforting warmth of Ethan's arms. For the first time in her life, she felt a profound sense of peace. The anxious knot that had lived permanently in her stomach was gone, replaced by a deep, humming contentment. She was loved. She belonged. She lay there for a long moment, memorizing the feel of his steady breathing, the possessive weight of his arm over her waist, the scent of him on her skin. This perfect, fragile moment was everything she had never dared to dream of. A discreet knock at the door shattered the tranquility. A guard entered and murmured about an urgent dispatch from the southern border. Ethan awoke instantly, the shift from slumbering mate to alert king seamless. He gave her a deep, lingering kiss that promised a return, dressed quickly, and was gone, leaving the vast chambers feeling suddenly empty. Filled with a new, quiet confidence, Jenny decided to walk in the gardens. She felt a sense of ownership now, a feeling of home that had previously eluded her. She wanted to thank Lord Valerius, Ethan's grizzled old advisor. He had been skeptical of her at first, but after she had uncovered the plot, his attitude had shifted to one of gruff, paternal respect. She felt she had, in some small way, earned his trust. As she approached his study in the western wing, she noticed the heavy oak door was slightly ajar. She heard his voice, a low rumble, and paused, not wanting to interrupt. "The shipment was a failure," Valerius was saying, his tone clipped and angry. "But the little Omega bitch has served her purpose. She has him distracted. He trusts her." A cold dread began to seep into Jenny's bones. That was not how Valerius spoke of her. Another voice answered, one that was chillingly familiar, the smooth, cultured arrogance from the library. "His trust is his weakness. Kael's public challenge has stirred the old bloods. The king's obsession with this barren stray is making them question his judgment. We strike again during the new moon." Jenny's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She peered through the thin crack in the door. Lord Valerius stood over a table, and in his hand, he was turning over a long, thin dagger with a wickedly curved tip. Dark, dried poison still stained the blade. It was the twin to the one that had been meant for her heart, the one that had wounded her king. Valerius, the loyal advisor, the man who had been in the armory when she'd warned them, the man who had access to every one of Ethan's plans. He was the traitor. He had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, his gruff loyalty, the perfect disguise. The beautiful morning shattered into a million pieces. The safety she had felt in Ethan's arms was a lie. The entire court was a viper's nest, and the most venomous serpent of all had been coiled right at the foot of the throne. A wave of nauseating guilt washed over her. The traitors were striking again because of her. Her presence, her influence, the king's love for her. It was all being used as a weapon against him. She had not saved him. She had only made him more vulnerable. Chapter 16. The ambush panic was a living thing, clawing its way up Jenny's throat. Lord Valerius. The name echoed in her mind, a drumbeat of betrayal. She had to warn Ethan. She raced from the gardens, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in her own chest. She flew through the corridors, ignoring the startled looks from courtiers and guards, a single desperate purpose propelling her forward: find him. But she was too late. When she burst into the armory, it was empty. One of the remaining guards informed her the king had already departed for his inspection of the southern wall, the exact blind spot the traitors had mentioned. A cold, heavy dread settled in her stomach. She was running a race she had already lost. Grabbing the arm of a young, loyal-looking guard named Thomas, whose life she had once saved in the infirmary, she pleaded with him to take her. He hesitated, but the terror in her eyes must have convinced him. They rode hard, the wind whipping at her face, her mind a maelstrom of horrific possibilities. They arrived at a secluded, crumbling section of the ancient wall, just as the sounds of battle reached them. The brutal, ugly clang of steel on steel and the savage snarls of wolves locked in combat. It had already begun. Jenny scrambled from her horse and crept to the edge of a rocky outcrop overlooking the scene. Her worst fears were a pale imitation of the reality below. Ethan was surrounded. At least a dozen warriors, their faces concealed by grim iron helms, fought with a coordinated ferocity. And leading them, his grizzled face a mask of cold determination, was Valerius. Ethan was a force of nature, a whirlwind of deadly grace. His great sword was a blur of silver, each movement precise, each blow fatal. But for every traitor he cut down, two more seemed to take their place. He was protecting the small handful of his own guards, his body a living shield against the tide of enemies. Jenny was utterly, agonizingly powerless. She was a healer, not a warrior. All she could do was watch in frozen horror, her hands clenched into useless fists. The scent of fresh blood, coppery and sharp, drifted up to her, a sickening perfume of death. This was her fault. She had brought this doom upon him. Her presence had been the catalyst for this betrayal, this slaughter. Then she saw it. An archer perched on a higher section of the wall. As Ethan parried a blow from Valerius himself, the archer drew his bow. The arrow was black, its tip coated in the same dark, viscous poison from the assassin's dagger. "Ethan!" she screamed, the sound torn from her throat, but it was lost in the din of battle. The arrow flew, a black streak of death. Ethan must have heard something in her cry, some note of warning because he started to turn. It wasn't enough. The arrow struck him high in the shoulder, burying itself deep. A choked, inhuman sound of pain was ripped from his chest. He staggered, falling to one knee. His silver eyes, glazed with agony, swept the ridge and found hers. For a single, heart-stopping moment, their gazes locked, and she saw not a king, but a man, her mate, broken and bleeding because of her. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed onto the blood-soaked ground. The king had fallen. Chapter 17. The Twist of the Knife. The world became a nightmarish blur of shouted commands, retreating traitors, and the desperate scramble to save the king. They got him back to the castle, to the healer's wing, a trail of his blood marking the path like a grim prophecy. He was alive, but barely. The poison from the arrow was a thing of dark magic, a creeping venom that resisted every poultice, every chant, every desperate attempt to draw it out. It was devouring him from the inside, and Jenny could only sit by his bedside, clutching his cooling hand, her own healing abilities utterly useless against this kind of ancient evil. Every ragged breath he took was a fresh wave of guilt that threatened to drown her. She had stayed there for a day and a night when a hollow, familiar voice pulled her from her vigil. "It's a pity, isn't it?" Kael stood in the doorway of a small antechamber where she had gone to fetch more water. To see a god bleed. He looked different. The feigned remorse was gone, replaced by a cold, triumphant light in his eyes. He had sided with them, with the traitors. "Get out!" she rasped, her voice raw. "Oh, I think you'll want to hear this," he said, stepping into the room. "Because you deserve to know the truth. You've been the star of this tragedy all along, and you never even knew it." He leaned against a tapestry, the very picture of casual cruelty. Did you ever stop to wonder, Jenny? Why you? Why, of all the she-wolves in all the packs, were you the one born barren? It wasn't some random misfortune. It wasn't a punishment from the goddess. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, twisting the knife. It was a design. A cold dread, deeper and more terrifying than anything she had felt before, began to uncoil in her soul. Kael's smile was a venomous slash. Your great-grandmother made a pact with a coven of witches, the same witches who serve Alpha Marcus and bless that arrow. She traded her fertility for a taste of power. The witches cursed her line in return. A curse that would lie dormant for generations, waiting for the perfect moment to bloom, waiting for a daughter of her line to be fated to an Alpha King of Ethan's bloodline. It couldn't be true. It was a lie. A monstrous, twisted lie. The curse, Kael continued, savoring every word, was that you would be born barren. You would be broken in a way that would make you crave acceptance, crave a powerful mate. And your fated bond, the so-called miracle that defied the king's own curse, that was the final key, the trigger. The moment you two bonded, you became a beacon for his enemies. Your love didn't break his curse, Jenny. It activated yours. The truth crashed down on her with the force of a collapsing mountain. Her barrenness wasn't her shame, it was her purpose. She had been engineered, a living weapon designed to bring about the king's downfall. Their bond wasn't a miracle. It was a perfectly crafted doom. Chapter 18. The Shattering. All hope turned to ash. There was no path forward, no way to fight a destiny that had been written in her blood before she was even born. She was a plague. The only cure, the only way to save Ethan now, was to remove the source of the infection, to remove herself. Jenny walked back to her opulent chambers, the suite that had once felt like a cage and had briefly, beautifully, felt like a home. Now, it was just a room. She ignored the silk gowns and the jewels. From the bottom of a chest, she pulled out the simple gray wool dress she had arrived in. She shed the finery of the queen and put on the drab shroud of the outcast. She was not leaving a life behind. She was returning to who she had always been. She was packing a small satchel with a loaf of bread and a skin of water when the chamber door creaked open. He stood there, leaning heavily against the frame, a ghost of the man he had been. He was pale as death, his arm in a black sling, bandages visible beneath his open-necked tunic. But he was on his feet, and his silver eyes, though clouded with pain, were fixed on her and the bag in her hand with a burning intensity. "You're leaving," he stated, his voice a hoarse rasp. Tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back began to stream down her face. "I have to," she choked out. "Don't you see? It's me. I'm the curse. The witches, my family, our bond. It was all a trap, and you walked right into it because of me." "That is a lie," he grated out, taking a painful step into the room. "A poison Kael fed you when you were weak." "It's the truth," she cried, the words tearing from her soul. "Everything bad that has happened, every drop of blood you have shed is because of me. If I stay, you will die. It is the only thing I have left to give you. My absence." She was so lost in the sea of her own self-hatred, so convinced of the toxic destiny woven into her very being, that his words couldn't reach her. She fell back on the one wound that had defined her for so long, the one truth she could cling to in this whirlwind of lies. It was her final, desperate attempt to push him away, to make him let her go. "It doesn't matter anyway," she sobbed, the words shattering in the quiet room. "Even if we survived this, even if we defeated them all, I can't give you what a king needs. I can't give you an heir." He just stared at her. He had dragged himself from his deathbed, his body a canvas of agony to stop her from leaving. He had fought traitors and defied a curse for her, and all she could see, all she could offer him was her own brokenness. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The force of her despair, the sheer absolute conviction of her own worthlessness, seemed to strike him dumb. The silence stretched, a vast, echoing chasm between them. And in that quiet, Jenny heard the one thing she had always been terrified of hearing. In his silence, she heard agreement. The final, unspoken confirmation that she was and always would be not enough. Her heart, the one she had so foolishly allowed to hope, finally, completely, shattered. Chapter 19. The Truth of the Bond. She took a step toward the door, her meager bag a dead weight in her hand. Her heart was a hollow, echoing chamber, the shattered pieces lying in the dust of her broken hope. This was it. The final act of love she could offer him was to vanish from his life. But before she could take a second step, his voice, rough with pain and a raw, desperate power, cut through the silence. Stop. He pushed himself away from the doorframe, his body trembling with the effort. You will not leave this room. There is nothing left, she whispered, her back still to him. There is everything left, he growled. He crossed the space between them, his movements slow and agonizing, and gripped her shoulder, forcing her to turn and face him. You think my silence was agreement? He demanded, his silver eyes blazing with a fire that defied his wounds. My silence was shock. It was the absolute horror of realizing the true depth of the poison you have been forced to drink your entire life. I was silent because for a single shattering moment, I had no words powerful enough to fight a lie you have believed for 1,000 years. The conviction in his voice was a physical force, a battering ram against the fortress of her despair. You think you are my weakness? He continued, his grip on her shoulder tightening. Jenny, you are the only reason I am still standing. You are the only reason I have a life left to save. He explained then, the words pouring from him in a torrent of fierce, desperate truth. His curse was not just a lack of a mate. It was a slow, creeping death of the soul, a hollowing out that had been draining his life force since birth. The witches had not accounted for a bond so strong it could defy their magic. Our bond isn't the trigger for a curse, he said, his eyes boring into hers. It is the cure. Every moment I am with you, every touch, every breath, and it pushes back the darkness inside me. It is healing me. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers tangling in her hair, forcing her to see the truth in his gaze. Listen to me. I do not need an heir to continue my line. I need you to have a life worth continuing. I choose you, not a womb, not a title, not a future pup. You. All of your broken, beautiful, perfect pieces. His words were not just a comfort, they were a cataclysm. They struck the bedrock of her self-hatred and cracked it wide open. A single, painful ray of light pierced through the suffocating darkness. Could it be true? Could her deepest wound actually be her greatest strength? She looked at him, truly looked at him, at the pain he was enduring, at the raw, desperate love in his eyes. And she made a choice. She chose to believe him. The satchel dropped from her numb fingers, thudding softly onto the carpet. She sagged against him, a sob tearing from her chest, not of sorrow, but of a painful, overwhelming, cathartic release. He wrapped his arms around her, and the bond, which had felt so frayed and broken, flared to life, a searing, brilliant nova of renewed hope. Chapter 20. Rallying the Loyalists. The dawn that followed was not one of despair, but of grim purpose. They were no longer two separate, wounded entities. They were a united front. The first step was to excise the poison from their own court. Ethan, leaning on Jenny for support, summoned a secret council in the castle's hidden war room. Only a handful were called. The grizzled captain of his personal guard, the young warrior Thomas who had ridden with Jenny, and two older, lesser lords who had long been rivals of Valerius. The air in the stone chamber was thick with suspicion and fear. Ethan stood before them, his presence no less commanding for his injuries. Jenny was at his side, not a step behind him. Lord Valerius is a traitor, he announced without preamble, his voice ringing with cold iron. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the small group. Valerius was a fixture, a man renowned for his loyalty. Before their skepticism could take root, Ethan turned his head slightly. "My mate will tell you what she witnessed." All eyes fell on Jenny. The old fear, the instinct to shrink away, was a distant ghost. She met their gazes, one by one. In a clear, steady voice, she recounted every word she had overheard in Valerius's study. She described the dagger, the mention of Kael, the plot to strike again at the new moon. When she finished, the guard captain still looked troubled. "My queen, your word is compelling, but Valerius is cunning. He will deny it. We need more than an overheard conversation to move against a man of his standing." This was her moment. This was where she proved she was more than just the king's weakness. "The arrowhead that struck the king," she said, her healer's mind taking over. "The poison on it had a faint scent of frost bloom, did it not?" The captain nodded slowly. "Frost bloom only grows on the highest, coldest peaks of the Black Mountains, Alpha Marcus's territory." She then looked at Thomas. "And the traitors who ambushed you, did you notice the fletching on their arrows? Was it gray and black?" The young guard's eyes widened. "Yes, my queen, the mark of the Black Mountain archers." She had connected them. Her quiet observation had forged the first solid link in the chain of treason. The last of the doubt in the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard fury. Jenny was no longer just a victim or a lover. She was a strategist, a witness, an asset. A plan began to form, not of defense, but of attack. They would use the traitor's own timeline against them, laying a trap that Valerius and his allies would walk right into. And as the loyalists began to debate troop movements and strategies, Jenny was in the thick of it, her voice quiet but sure, a queen helping to lead her people to war. Chapter 21, The Queen's Mark. The eve of the battle descended upon the castle, a heavy blanket of anticipation and dread. The air hummed with the sound of sharpening steel and murmured prayers. Every soldier, every servant, was preparing for the violence that the dawn would bring. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Ethan and Jenny found a moment of quiet solitude in his chambers, the place where she had shattered and where he had pieced her back together. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, a silent witness to their final, peaceful moments. Jenny felt a strange, profound calm. The fear was gone, burned away by the fires of purpose and a love she now knew to be unbreakable. She turned to Ethan, who was watching her, his expression a mixture of awe and fierce devotion. "Fated bonds are the will of the goddess," she said softly, her voice resonating with a newfound authority. "But a partnership is the will of two wolves. It must be chosen, forged, made equal." In their culture, the tradition was absolute. The male marked the female, a brand of possession, a claim of protection. It was a beautiful ritual, but it was unbalanced. "You are my king," she continued, stepping closer until she could rest her hand on his heart, feeling its steady, powerful beat. "And you are my mate, but I am your queen, not your subject, not a treasure to be protected behind walls. Your partner." From a small sheath on her belt, she drew a tiny, razor-sharp silver blade, its edge gleaming in the firelight. Before he could fully process her intent, she made a swift, shallow cut on her own bottom lip, a single bright bead of crimson welling up. His eyes widened, not in alarm, but in sudden, profound understanding. A slow, breathtaking smile touched his lips. He tilted his head, baring the powerful column of his neck and shoulder to her, an act of ultimate trust and submission. She leaned forward, and with a fierce, possessive tenderness, she sank her teeth into the spot just above his collarbone, marking him, claiming him as her own. It was not a bite of passion, but a seal of an unbreakable pact. A declaration to the world, to the gods, to their enemies, that he was hers to defend just as she was his. A blinding, incandescent power surged through the bond, a shockwave of pure energy that left them both breathless. It was a new magic, a magic born not of ancient curses or fated accidents, but of a chosen, defiant, and absolute love. They broke apart, both trembling, both marked. He reached up and gently touched the new mark on his shoulder, then brushed the small cut on her lip with his thumb, a gesture of infinite reverence. They stood together, equals, facing the coming dawn not as a king and his consort, but as two halves of a single warrior soul. The stage was set. The battle for their kingdom, for their lives, for their love, was about to begin. Chapter 22. War of Wolves' dawn broke cold and gray, the sun a pale, hesitant smear on the horizon. The air in the castle courtyard was still, yet it vibrated with the tense, coiled energy of a predator about to strike. This was not a place of execution. It was an anvil where the fate of the kingdom would be forged in blood and steel. Jenny stood on the battlements overlooking the main gate, a vantage point she had chosen herself. She was not a warrior destined for the front lines, but she would not hide. She was a healer, and her battlefield was here, organizing the reserves, directing the flow of supplies, and preparing to mend the bodies the fighting would surely break. The trap was set. Now, they waited. The horn sounded shortly after sunrise, a mournful, brazen cry from the approaching traders. They emerged from the woods, a formidable army led by Alpha Marcus, with Kael at his side and Valerius directing the siege engines. They expected to find a castle in chaos, a king weakened, and a court divided. They found a silent, waiting fortress. The battle, when it erupted, was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The clash of swords, the splintering of shields, the savage snarls of wolves in their shifted forms, it all blended into a single deafening roar. Jenny's heart pounded in time with the war drums, but her hands were steady. She directed healers, comforted the terrified, and worked with a calm, fierce efficiency she never knew she possessed. From her vantage point, she saw Ethan. He moved through the battle not just as a king, but as a legend, his great sword a blur of silver, his presence a rallying point for the loyalists. He and Jenny were a different kind of whole now. He was the sword, and she was the shield, and through the hum of their bond, she felt his strength, and he, hers. But the traitors were desperate. Seeing their primary assault falter, Valerius executed a secondary plan. A small, elite group of warriors, using a concealed passage Valerius alone knew of, breached the inner wall. Their target was not the king. It was the queen. He burst onto the battlements, his face a mask of sweating, desperate fury, his sword dripping with the blood of the guards he'd cut down to reach her. "The Baron Omega," he sneered, advancing on her. "I'll take the king's little pet, and he will kneel." Ethan was engaged with Marcus below, a brutal, earth-shaking duel between alphas. He could not reach her. For a heartbeat, the old, freezing terror seized her. But then she looked at the pouch on her belt. She was not a warrior. She was a healer. And a healer knows poisons as well as cures. As Valerius lunged, she did not scream or flee. She reached into her pouch, grabbed a handful of finely ground wolf-tooth powder, and threw it directly into his face. He roared in agony as the caustic dust hit his eyes, blinding him instantly. He swung his sword wildly, and in that moment of confusion, she drew the small, sharp blade she used for cutting herbs and bandages and lunged forward, sinking it deep into the exposed tendon behind his knee. He collapsed with a howl of pain and rage, utterly incapacitated. She stood over him, breathing heavily, the bloody knife in her hand, having proven her worth not with the strength of a warrior but with the wisdom of a healer. She was enough. Chapter 23. The Strength of Scars. The final cry of the battle faded with the setting sun, leaving behind a courtyard choked with the grim aftermath of war. The rebellion was crushed. Marcus was dead, Valerius and Kael in chains, their forces scattered or surrendered. But victory was a bloody, exhausted thing. The scent of spilled life was heavy on the air, and the groans of the wounded were a somber chorus against the rising wind. The adrenaline that had sustained Jenny through the long, terrifying day drained away. leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. She was no longer a commander on the wall. She was a healer among her people. She moved through the makeshift infirmary, her hands steady, her voice a low, comforting murmur as she stitched wounds, set bones, and offered what little solace she could. Her simple gray dress was stained dark with the blood of men who had fought for her, for their king. Finally, she found him. Ethan sat on the steps of the great hall, his great sword resting on the stone beside him, his head bowed in exhaustion. His armor was dented and smeared with grime, and a long, ragged gash wept blood from his side, an injury he had ignored in the final, furious moments of the fight. He looked up as she approached, and the weariness in his silver eyes was vast. He had won his kingdom back, but the cost had been immense. Without a word, Jenny knelt before him, opening her healer's satchel. He did not protest. He simply watched her, his gaze full of a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. The dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. Here, in the ruins of their victory, she was not the one in need of protection. He was wounded, and she was his strength. Her fingers, deft and sure, cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm. He hissed in pain as she began to stitch the torn flesh, but he did not pull away. The chaos of the world receded, leaving only the two of them in a small bubble of quiet intimacy, the king and queen, tending to the wounds of a war they had won together. As she tied off the final stitch, her hands lingered on his side. He reached up, his calloused, blood-stained fingers gently cupping her jaw. "My life was a hollow thing," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, the words meant for her alone. "A kingdom of shadows. You brought the dawn, Jenny." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. "My life was forfeit today. You gave it back to me. It is yours. My reign, my heart, my every breath. It all belongs to you, forever." She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The external war was over, and in its place, an unshakable peace, forged in fire and sealed with a vow, had finally begun. Chapter 24. The Alpha Queen. A month later, the great hall was filled once more. The scars of battle had been scrubbed from the stone, the broken tables replaced, and new tapestries hung on the walls, depicting not ancient hunts, but a great black wolf fighting beside a slender gray one. The mood was not celebratory, but one of profound, solemn rebirth. The surviving loyalist alphas were in attendance, as were the elders from every pack, including a delegation from a humbled and leaderless Silver Creek. They had all gathered to reaffirm their fealty to the king, and to bear witness to the queen who now stood beside him. Jenny stood before a long mirror in her chambers, preparing. She no longer saw the ghost of a frightened, broken girl. She saw a woman whose eyes held the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who had walked through hell and emerged with the ashes still on her skin. She saw a healer, a strategist, a survivor. She saw a queen. She chose a simple gown of deep forest green, the color of new life, and walked to the throne room not with a racing heart, but with a calm, steady stride. Ethan was waiting for her, his own wounds now silver scars. He offered her his hand, not to lead her, but to walk beside her. As they entered the great hall together, a respectful silence fell. The whispers that followed her this time were not of scorn or pity, but of awe. They did not see the Baron Omega. They saw the queen who had blinded the traitor, the mate whose intelligence had exposed the conspiracy, the healer whose hands had saved 100 wolves. She walked with her head held high, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd, her presence as commanding as Ethan's. He was the kingdom's sword, and she its heart. They took their places on the twin thrones, no longer one large and one small, but two of equal stature. Her gaze drifted across the hall, eventually landing on the very spot by the stone pillar where Kael had shattered her world with his cruel words so long ago. She remembered the girl who had stood there, desperate for invisibility, convinced of her own worthlessness. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. That girl was gone, but not forgotten. She was a part of the foundation upon which this new woman, this queen, had been built. The core emotional question that had haunted her life had finally been answered. She had been mocked as barren, dismissed as broken. And yet, here she was, chosen, loved, and claimed, not for a womb that could carry a pup, but for a spirit that could carry a kingdom.